Okay, hello and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Andrew Crane, Assistant Director in Comcare's Education and Engagement team, and I'll be your MC for today's event. First, I'd like to acknowledge traditional custodians of the lands on which we're meeting virtually today. I'm in Canberra, in Ngunnawal country, and I'd like to recognise the Ngunnawal people who are traditional custodians of the land where I am. I want to acknowledge elders past and present and recognise the contribution that they have made and continue to make across our nation. I'd also like to acknowledge all traditional custodians, Indigenous Australians, Torres Strait Islander people who are with us today, and thank everyone who's joined today, being part of the webinar and being part of the conversation. Please feel free to let us know in the chat which land you're joining from today. A bit of housekeeping to get us going. So we really want to encourage you to get involved today by participating in the chat with your questions and comments. The chat function should allow you to like or love somebody else's comment as well, if they've said something you agree with or you were going to say yourself. If you're using MS Teams application, you might receive audio or pop-up notifications through the session as the chat messages come in, and this might be a bit of a distraction. So there's some instructions on the screen now how to turn off the notification alert sounds and pop-ups. We're going to be recording today's session, so your camera and audio functions have been deactivated, so it's only myself and our guest speaker, Sharon, who'll be on the screen and recorded, so no need to worry about your audio or video coming through. Comcare's webinars are intended to bring together a wide variety of people from across the Comcare scheme, from other work health safety jurisdictions and within our jurisdiction. So for those of you who are joining for the first time, thanks very much for joining us. And for those returning, welcome back. It's great to have you with us today. When you registered for the webinar, there was an option to ask a question of our guest speaker. So the webinar today is going to be a discussion where we're going to explore the topic and ask your questions around work health safety systems and the future of work. So we're extremely fortunate to have Professor Sharon Newnam with us today. Professor Sharon Newnam is the head of School of Psychology and Counselling at Queensland University of Technology. Sharon's published widely in the area of workplace safety from a systems thinking perspective, and she's applied this knowledge to improve safety across industries, including transport and healthcare. Sharon's a prolific author and is an associate editor of the leading safety journal, Safety Science. She's an international member on Transportation Research Board Committee, which is a division of the National Academies of Science, Engineering and Medicine. So it's with great pleasure I welcome Professor Sharon Newnam. Welcome, Sharon.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks for being with us today. So as a bit of an opener or an interest question, keen to ask you about what's actually got you interested in work health safety systems and systems thinking.
Yeah, great question. So first of all, some of you on the call may know that I was previously at the Monash University Accident Research Centre and have recently transitioned to Queensland University of Technology. So same person, same topic in terms of systems thinking, in particular system thinking tools. I think that's the question in itself is great because I come from a background as an organisational psychologist, and workplace safety is something that can create significant impact. And I suppose on the journey, or my academic journey to start with, I wanted to ensure that I'm not only dealing with ivory tower concepts, but I was wanting to create some change at the frontline level. And so safety seemed to be something that made a lot of sense to me. It's significant in terms of its impact on society and workplaces and in community levels. So I think that's the main driver of my interest in workplace safety, is being able to make that change.
Yeah, great. So obviously the topic of today is about safety systems, and I should point out that Comcare as the regulator looks at systems of an organisation that they have in place to manage work health and safety. And that's to, of course, check that organisations have an effective system for managing risk, and if something actually does go wrong, that they use those systems that they had in place. I should point out actually that Comcare uses, and the Work Health Safety Act uses this term PCBU, which is an acronym for person conducting a business or undertaking, which in most contexts really just means a business or an organisation. So for today's talk, we'll try to keep it simple, plain English, and use the terms business or organisation as we slip into habits. So yeah, Comcare conducts both proactive and reactive audits of organisations' work health and safety systems. When we've reviewed those findings across many of the audits, we've found that a range of things seems to set those that perform well apart from those that don't. So it includes, but it's not really limited to, things like management commitment, having that's documented and it's evidenced by both behaviour, talking the talk, and the kind of the walking the walk versus the system that sits on the shelf that's signed off but nobody pays too much attention to until, of course, the regulator comes knocking. Having a clear set of well-developed objectives and targets, having a strategy or an action plan that's actually got steps that are measurable with time frames and milestones, and also a robust approach to actually determine and review work health safety resourcing in their organisation. So I'm really interested in your thoughts on this and if that resonates with things that you've found or if you've got other perspectives we should consider.
Yeah, great question. And some of the other questions that have been raised by the audience are around the evolution of workplace safety. And over the last 40, 50 years now, essentially researchers and practitioners have been trying to identify what are those key elements of a workplace that create a safe working environment. And we look at, as you mentioned, many of those things that you just mentioned there have been identified, with management commitment being one of the most frequently identified elements within a workplace system. I think over the years, we've more transitioned into this thinking of more systems thinking approach. Essentially, that means that we don't look at isolated elements of the system. We categorise a system based on levels within the system, from the equipment to surrounding environments up to the role of government and regulators. And I think this way to be able to describe a system based on levels, based on categories, based on the risk factors, and particularly non-linear thinking about the relationship between risk factors within the system, starts that evolution in thinking of, well, one isolated element within workplace safety and controlling that is unlikely to fix the system. So if you're just going to fix a system through changing or implementing training, ensuring that there's a culture of safety, all incredibly important, but in isolation to changing the system and creating that systemic change, it is not going to be sustainable over time. And I think the best example in that is looking at the hierarchy of controls, where you've got the soft controls and you've got the hard controls. And the traditional approach is look at, well, what are the controls that, well, we need to have moved towards the hard controls. But unless, again, we apply those systems thinking principles to understanding what is the interaction between factors in the system, what is the flow of communication across the system, how do these factors interrelate? And essentially, what is how are we building a system to be resilient to people performing tasks in their own way and more efficiently over time? So those key principles need to be taken into account when looking at any workplace system, and the interaction essentially between others in the system, and is it actually aligning well with the risk factors?
Yeah, right. Okay, thanks. Interesting. So, of course, the conversation we're having today will be using most of the questions that have come from our audience. So we've sort of merged a few of them together, and we've had a few questions that have related to systems and culture, which you mentioned earlier. And one person, for example, mentioned, can a work health safety management system create a culture of safety, or do you actually need a culture of safety to be able to implement one? Is this a chicken and the egg type?
It's exactly what I was just about to say. It's a bit of the chicken and the egg. A lot of my research has focused on safety culture, and in particular the role of management and line supervision in terms of creating a culture which is safe, which is valued and prioritised. That perception of safety culture is found to be incredibly important in improving safe working behaviours and reducing incidents. That's without a doubt. But cultural elements, when you're thinking about the hierarchy of controls, that is considered to be a soft control. So changing that in isolation of eliminating the risk isn't likely to be effective. So again, it's looking at those system of factors and what are the system of controls, I should say, and how they're going to interact to create a safe working system. So when you're talking systems thinking, it's not there's no silver bullet approach. That's essentially the underlying philosophy. It's looking at culture, which undoubtedly it underpins how things operate within the organisation. But unless you have all of those risk management elements, policies and procedures, you have appropriate equipment, you have the training, you eliminate risks essentially with these controls, that culture essentially will only get you so far. So it is that combination. And I think understanding what culture is to start with is incredibly important. And a lot of the times we just talk about culture it's about management commitment. But I think when you get down into the level of talking, what is actually, how is culture created? And that's about the quality of the relationship between workers and their line management. And that's where I've focused a lot of my research, and in particular in the area of transportation, that's incredibly important. I think when you've got, which is partly some of the questions that have been answered, when you've got individuals that are working outside the physical boundaries of the organisation, how do you create a culture with these individuals of that safety is valued and prioritised? Culture is considered to be built on feedback from the line supervisor, timely feedback, I should say, and the ability to monitor behaviour and to provide goal setting. And so essentially when a person is working outside the physical boundaries of organisation, i.e. the remote worker, those two behavioural mechanisms for motivating safe behaviour are gone. So what do we do about this? And it's a challenge for management. So it's been able to develop the skills of supervisors in being able to develop those relationships to identify and manage risk within the workplace. Then just dovetailing onto that too, there's questions regarding technology, use of technology and being able to strengthen safety within an organisation. And along those same lines, I think it is possible because technology does provide the mechanism to be able to objectively monitor behaviour, provide timely feedback and to institute goal setting exercises. However, if you rely on technology to create the culture, it essentially means that you'll be most likely monitoring negative behaviour, where on the other side of it, you can actually turn this into a positive and integrate that technology within the safety management practices of supervisors so they can engage with workers that are remote workers in terms of essentially those risks that are created or captured when working remotely, and to question those risks and to be able to manage those situations effectively. So yes, I think technology in that is a possible solution for it, but it needs to be handled so carefully because it needs to be well integrated within workplace practices. Again, really drawing upon those systems thinking principles.
Yeah, right. Okay, thanks. So yeah, interesting thinking about technology in that space as well. And at the risk of going down the wormhole of culture and talking about safety culture is a term's not something that's sort of definitively defined, is it? It's one of those things that's sort of more discovered, or some people have said it's an emergent property or something, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And in 40 years of research, or 50 years now, is about defining it. And I do have to giggle at the academics, me being one myself and have done it, tried to define it. Just another paper out there defining what safety culture is and then differentiating that with safety climate. I think at the ground level, what does that actually mean? So I've done away with this whole concept of let's stop trying to define it and actually focus on what it means. And if you look at the core of it, it's about the value and priority given to safety and that perception. So if it's a perception, how is that perception formed? And as I mentioned, a lot of my research is focused on supervisors can create a culture where safety is valued and prioritised. So strengthening that relationship between workers and their supervisors is incredibly powerful in creating this culture. And going on from that initial discovery of mine, I actually specifically looked at the role of communication within the workplace and how does effective communication play a role in creating safe working practice, or the perception of safety and the value given to priority and safety.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, we'll step away from this space because I think we could spend an hour or more just talking about safety culture. One of those things, it's not static, but it's dynamic, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
So in addition to your background as both a professor and the head of School of Psychology and Counselling, you're also an associate editor of the safety journal, the Journal of Safety Science. So I'm guessing that's exposed you to a lot of the contemporary thinking and practice related to workplace health and safety. Have you seen much change in the thinking around safety systems? This, of course, connects to a few of the questions we've had, such as there doesn't seem to be a lot of evolution, or what evolution do you see, or have you seen much system change since COVID? So feel free to tackle that. The short, medium, or long.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting question. And I often give webinars as part of systems thinking, my instant investigation tools, which I've developed. And those webinars particularly focus on the evolution of accident causation models, coming from the simple linear to the complex linear to systems thinking approach. And from my perspective, you see pockets of systems thinking. You see pockets by systems thinking really looking at a non-linear approach, so avoiding blame of any particular element or actor in the system, looking at the interaction between factors within the system. That's really to the core of what systems thinking is, that complexity, the dynamic. It's a very dynamic system. So I have seen pockets of that. So healthcare, for example, WorkSafe Victoria, I've been working with them since 2018 in the development of systems thinking investigation tools. So we've been able to map out the risk factors. This tool maps out the risk factors associated with incidents and then develops action plans based on the analysis of those risk factors. And that is being created quite a following, to the point that we're about to launch an app that specifically looks at simplifying the process of investigation or review of incidents, and creates the AXI map, or the accident map, which is the long version of AXI map, in real time to actually show those system of factors and the complexity of that system. So healthcare, Victoria, absolutely, you see pockets of this understanding of what systems thinking is. It feels to me, with the people that I've worked with in the healthcare sector, transportation to some degree at the same time too, that as soon as you understand these concepts of systems thinking, and avoid that thinking about that an individual is to blame, which we tend to do a lot in transportation, we then start to think in systems and you don't go back. But that message and that thinking is not, that hasn't been widespread within workplace safety culture. So that's essentially the mission of our systems thinking investigation tools, is to spread that message around. We need to look at risk factors beyond the frontline staff and equipment, surrounding environments. We need to look at risk factors at operations management level, at government regulatory levels, not for the purpose of blaming. It's not. It's pieces of the puzzle. And if we understand what all those pieces of the puzzles are and how they interconnect, we can create a system of safety. But without that full picture, we're just not going to get there. So I think that's the thinking, and I think there's a little bit of, it scares people, organisations to a certain degree, to actually go down the systems thinking path, because there's the potential that operations management or even regulators and government will be blamed. And again, it's not about blame. That's what we want to ensure that doesn't happen. And it's not according to systems thinking principles at all. If that was the case, action plans that are developed through these tools clearly show multiple actions across the system, and particularly those systemic, those actions that are created at higher levels of the framework essentially have the potential to mitigate against pressures of risk factors at lower levels of the system. So it's essentially we're creating actions that have bigger bang for the buck in the end. So it makes a lot of sense from a business case perspective, a societal perspective, improving workplace safety.
Yeah, okay, great. And yeah, we've got an interesting question/comment that's popped in, which is about trust. Is trust a key element? And if so, what actions, measures create trust in an organisation? I might throw something in there as well, which you mentioned blame. I almost wonder whether, as a society, we've had kind of a view around safety which is focused on blame. I think, our media and that sort of stuff, it's, the first question is who was, to blame rather than what was the, cause of this at a larger system level. Yeah. So the question was around, trust, key element, actions and measures to create trust.
I 100% agree with that, and you're right. I think it is part of workplace safety. It's also looking at how do we train even media outlets to understand the system of factors that are involved in workplace safety. So that education is extremely important even in media reports. And we all know in the transportation area, it always comes down to the driver is to blame, and we need to move past that if we're going to create systemic change. And I think to be able to do that at the same time, 100% correct, trust is incredibly important. And in many organisations, you see that there is lack of trust through poor reporting practices. So we need to be able to report to understand, even down to near misses. We need to be able to use the systems frameworks, the models and the methods to map out even those near misses so that we can create risk controls that are capable of systemic change. Yep. But to do that, we need to improve reporting culture. But again, that comes down to safety culture and how that, in particular, relationships in the organisation. One great example is that the supervisor-worker relationship. If that's a strong relationship, you would hope that workers would feel comfortable reporting. So again, if you're sort of visualising it in your mind, you can see all of the different risk factors and how they could connect. And so I say, if you drink the systems thinking Kool-Aid, you just don't go back.
Yeah. I can certainly see how, from a media perspective, it doesn't provide simple and easy answers. Whereas you can point to one person, where as soon as you're starting to talk about the system, it's multifactorial. It's not just this; it's multiple layers.
Yes, absolutely correct. Yeah, there is no simple solution, but I think that collectively we need to be able to work together. So, and it's not only what I'm really trying to push in my program for research now is the connection between different agencies as well. So we can really leverage off the expertise of key stakeholders within the entire system. Rather, for example, just in the area of transportation, we tend to go to our roads regulatory authorities and assume that they know it all, yet putting all of that pressure, I suppose, for the road regulators to know it all sort of, I suppose, undermines that idea that there are so many different stakeholders and different controls, interventions within adjacent fields that actually could improve road safety. So it's been able to really broaden our thinking outside the box and leveraging off the expertise of those in sometimes unrelated fields. So I think that collaboration with key stakeholders across different sectors within those sectors of course, community, I think that we need more buy-in, essentially. We need more consultation.
Yeah, thanks. So one of the interesting terms that's been discussed in safety circles for a while now is workers imagined versus workers done. You're probably pretty familiar with this one. And part of that's that sort of recognition that, work does take place in a dynamic and it's a changing environment where it is really hard to predict the exact mix of factors that will be present on a given day or in a particular moment that'll affect how the work actually gets done. And I'm wondering if you've got sort of insights or a view on how we can reconcile this with the importance of a management system that tends to be static, or it's often developed and maintained at a distance from the front line.
Yeah, and I think that question particularly is very much aligned with we need to move towards systems thinking models and methods in the understanding of risk controls and then the development of a control framework to be able to mitigate risk. So it is, we're looking at complex dynamic systems. So therefore we can't look at simple linear approaches to workplace safety, just looking at the relation, the Band-Aid solution or the silver bullet approach to any type of intervention. It just doesn't cut it. You're not going to create that long-term sustainable change. We need that systemic change, and by using systems thinking models and methods, we can achieve that. And very happy to go through, anyone who's interested in what are these systems thinking models and methods, very happy to show you what we use in our program of research, and that's particularly Rasmussen's risk management framework and the AXIMAP technique, which essentially displays or illustrates all of the risk factors associated with incidents and the relationships between risk factors across levels of the system. So it clearly shows, essentially from looking at this map, that if you're going to be looking at controls at only one level of the system and a control that's targeting, for example, just training alone, when it just overlooks the system of factors, and you can see that by looking at these AXI maps. So it's a compelling argument to actually start thinking about what are the risks across the system and what are the gaps in our control structure to be able to mitigate against those risks.
Yeah, great. And we did have a question there. Is there any systems thinking literature that you would recommend, e.g. a meta-analysis or reviews or
There is a lot out there, absolutely. Some of the key system thinkers, particularly in Australia, is Paul Salmon and Gemma Reid from University of Sunshine Coast. We've got Natassia Good, who is in WorkSafe Victoria. I use the systems thinking models and methods myself, but I wouldn't say that I'm expert. You've got these people that are truly expert in it and beyond just risk management approach models and methods, but looking at control structures, network analysis. So there is a lot of literature out there. Some of it, I have to say, it's quite complex in its reading, and I think it can be condensed down into something that makes sense. And if you contact me, I can send you through one of the reports that we wrote for on the patient handling injury review tool. That's again a systems thinking tool for the investigation of patient handling injuries. And you can see it's a infographic report that essentially looks at systems thinking in action. So applying those key principles of systems thinking into the development of this tool. So it's sort of a nicer version of understanding how systems thinking works in action, and happy to share that. And it's on the WorkSafe Victoria website as well if you wanted to directly access it.
Yep, okay, great. And we did have a comment there from somebody, which is around their concern is that systems become so huge that they lose focus on the initial issues, maintaining good communication interaction with staff.
Yes, and I think that is when you present some like an AXI map, which essentially looks like a spaghetti diagram, it is very difficult to digest all of that information. One of the ways that we have got around that is the development of this systems thinking incident review app. So the STIR app, some of you may have heard of it, which is about to be launched. Let's say a month. I keep saying a month, but there keeps on being delays. But essentially, the system is the app is designed to be able to undertake reviews of incidents, and it breaks it down by the levels of the AXI map. So you've got the 5 levels of the system as we've described it. and you create the AXI map as you go. Where it gets confusing using the paper-based versions of AXI map is that you've got this spaghetti diagram. What do you do with it from there? One of the key strengths of the STIR app is that it isolates key issues within the system by, it sounds very simple, it's a color-coded system, but by being able to isolate those key issues, you're able to focus on the actions that are relevant to each of those key issues. And then it generates you go on to the next stage, essentially, where you can assign responsibility to those key actions. You can put a close-off date. You can look at measures of success. So it helps, it breaks down that concepts of systems thinking by not only creating the AXI map in live version, but it isolates those key issues so you can focus on what those actions are. So this was a development process since 2018 with so much input from the Victorian and New South Wales healthcare and aged care sector, really trying to understand how do you think and how can we apply systems thinking to best help your practices. So very happy to share information on STIR. It's a quite innovative approach. And again, I think I'd say it's just a fantastic example of systems thinking in action.
Yeah, great. And I've just been told by a support team that we'll consolidate some of the resources that are mentioned and some links as well. And in the chat, people have actually put in the names of some of those authors and researchers that you've highlighted. So thanks to our audience and our support team. Terrific. Okay. So moving on a little bit, we've also had a number of questions come in related to mental health and psychosocial hazards, as you might imagine. How to integrate psychosocial health and safety into work health safety systems. Another example is, how do you anticipate new psychosocial workplace risk requirements changing any of the currently expected elements of a system? I might just make a few Comcare comments in this element. So in the context of the recommended changes to the model work health safety laws that came out in the Boland Review, that was 2018, there's a model code of practice on managing psychosocial hazards at work, which most people will be aware of and many people will be aware of. That's being released, but it's worth pointing out that at this stage, the Act and regulations haven't changed regarding psychosocial risk, and that code of practice is, although approved, it is not in part of the Commonwealth legislation yet, so it's to be adopted, but it provides some pretty good guidance. And we know that psychosocial hazards do exist and they can present a risk to health and safety, and therefore they need to be managed as part of fulfilling a PCBU, there I go, an organisation's duty of care. So, yeah. So the questions back to harking back to those questions were, do you see that psychosocial risks challenging or changing work health safety systems, or work health safety systems having to be changed significantly to?
I think they need to be considered. So when you're looking at the risk profile within organisations, and how we have looked at the risk file is to map out what we refer to as a classification of risk factors. And how we've gone about doing that is to look at the literature, close consultation with key stakeholders within industry, government, even community, to look at what are the risk factors associated with incidents, regardless if it's workplace violence and aggression, work-related driving, patient handling. We look at those risk factors across those levels of the system through using those methods I just mentioned, and psychosocial hazards without a doubt need to be identified within that and wouldn't be excluded from a classification of risk factors. And we have developed tools specifically for looking at the review of incidents of workplace violence and aggression within City Council. So this project was done in collaboration with City Council, in particular Mark Perrott, and WorkSafe Victoria. And this tool, again, is specifically focusing on those risk factors. When you look at the the classification scheme for workplace violence and aggression, the risk factors, particularly at the higher levels, are pretty much the same as the risk factors associated with work-related driving, patient handling, injuries. There is some slight deviations or in terms of wording, and that can be contextual too, at the lower levels of the system where the work is done, such as frontline staff, equipment and surroundings. But again, coming back to systems thinking principles, if the end goal is to develop actions that are capable of systemic change, you're wanting consistency, I suppose, to understand what those risk factors at the higher levels of the system, because they are the same regardless of the types of incidents. It shows that we need to be looking at this from a holistic perspective and not looking at psychosocial hazards as being, in terms of controls, as being incredibly more different in terms of creating that systemic change than those associated with patient handling. The key themes, essentially, that is coming from those incident reports are the same in terms of the actions that need to change.
Yeah, interesting. I think one of the things that's really interesting about psychosocial hazards in particular is that it really challenges the thinking or the concept of a work health safety management system being something that's distinct from other organisational systems. You know, as any organisational system that intersects with people needs to be, you know, HR systems, you know, et cetera, need to be integrated or.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, and often that, you know, HR systems and risk management systems are considered in silos. And exactly what you said there, there needs to be that holistic approach. There needs to be an understanding that these systems should be working together, essentially, to develop a control structure to mitigate against risk, regardless if it's psychosocial hazards or manual handling hazards. How we're going to create systemic change is through developing actions at those higher levels of the system.
So I've got a question that's come through, which is in the context of a small organisation with hazards that have rare likelihood of severe consequences, i.e. a small number of incidents to track, what are some of the tools or methods that might be able to use to measure safety or effectiveness of a system?
Can you repeat that question? Sorry.
Yeah, so it's in the context of low signal. So yeah, where there's an organisation, a small organisation with hazards, but which are rare, but you know, high consequence. Are there tools or methods that might be able to be used to measure safety or effectiveness of a system?
Yeah, and exactly the same as I've been saying too. It's all about looking at those systems of risks and regard the context of a small business, and the systems and processes may differ, but ultimately the risk factors will be the same. The human is involved in it. If you're using the same equipment as in larger organisations, it could come down to more of those soft controls within the system may be different. However, the risk profile in itself is the same. So absolutely using systems thinking framework, as I mentioned, the STIR tool, the STIR app in particular, applicable to small, medium, large business, because the risk profile essentially is same, context different, and the degree of risk being different as well.
Yeah, is this also where we might need to actually start thinking outside organisational boundaries, that, you know, we actually need to kind of pull that risk awareness of like organisations to pick up on their safety data and find ways to be able to share incidents so we can see those low signal but high consequence.
And I think it's really important you've got the risk profile. And as I mentioned, I don't think the risk profile really is going to change with the introduction of new technologies. It will to a certain degree, but we are looking at the same risk profile. One of the things that I think we tend to forget about when we're looking at workplace safety is context is so important. So what may work in one organisation may not necessarily work in another organisation. So understanding that context is incredibly important. So I think lessons learned from others, absolutely, but being able to map the risk factors using a standardised method like we've done within the STIR app, I think is incredibly important in being able to understand how much context of the organisation influences the incident under review as opposed to the risk profile.
Another interesting comment here was in the interest of continuous improvement. We've upgraded our health and safety management systems. How do we win back people's goodwill in starting again? I guess that's part of, COVID's given us this opportunity to quickly iterate systems. Yeah, there's a challenge in maybe getting people offside because we're making so many changes, or.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the workplace. The workplace has changed incredibly since COVID. The flexibility in working arrangements definitely has changed. I think a really interesting example that has emerged in many of my consultations, has even been down to that. Because we're working from home, individuals are considered to be more accessible. So therefore, even getting down to having Zoom meetings while driving, it's legally you're not touching your phone. So therefore, it's a hands-free conversation. But some individuals organisations they're having even their camera on. When you've got multiple people that you are asked to potentially contribute to a group discussion, you may be called on at any stage to have that conversation essentially. That's a whole cognitive load that we have not considered within the driving task. And it has been identified as a key risk within some organisations. So this is one of these things that we refer to as a COVID creep, that we didn't sort of expect that this was going to happen. And like Zoom calls, teleconference calls within the vehicle, it's not a new thing, but it's increased since COVID because staff are considered to be more accessible and can take a phone call and a Zoom call wherever. So I think these are the kind of things that we need to think about very carefully in terms of the risks. The cognitive load associated with having those calls is I think it's actually really scary.
Yeah, thanks. And somebody did comment that that particular question wasn't necessarily related to COVID, so apologies there. But certainly one of the things that we have heard is that the challenge of consulting with workers and making sure that they're included in part of that process, so that they have some level of investment. And one of the things that I certainly have heard is the challenge of when a system is made in isolation of people and then imposed, that can certainly have difficulty in creating the trust or the buy-in.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think the consultation is key to creating any type of systemic change. I think without that consultation, you don't know if something is going to be feasible or practicable for implementation. Understanding what the risk profile is, you need to be able to talk to frontline staff and understand what those risks are. I think that's the beauty of having that systems thinking approach to workplace safety, is that you have that classification scheme which we have developed. By no means do I think that is the end. That's the final solution. There could be risk factors as workplace changes that can be added to that profile. We won't know that though until we consult. So it comes down to even to the practical level of developing that risk profile. Consultation is so key to ensure that there is sufficient flow of communication across the system, that the different interactions within the system are effective from an evaluation perspective as well. Again, we won't know that until we actually have evaluation systems that include consultation.
Yeah. So it's almost stepping beyond, consultation, often kind of has this impression of it's a bit of a one-way dialogue, or it's been a didactic exchange as opposed to a collaboration almost. So yeah, there's almost a step beyond that we could take, isn't there?
Absolutely. Two-way communication, it's key. And I think that's something that has consistently been found in the literature for, over 50 years now. That is so important in being able to create a strong workplace system. We could essentially, I would go down to saying that is one of the key things that we need to consider in the creation of any workplace system. Consultation, incredibly important, number one priority.
Yeah, great. And we've got a question here around if we can elaborate on what an effective management system review involving senior management might actually look like?
Well, a review, I'd certainly be plugging my assistant, WorkSafe Victoria, in consultation with healthcare and with New South Wales as well. We've developed the systems thinking incident review system, which I've mentioned. That I think is the most comprehensive approach to date, from the basis that it's based on systems thinking principles. So I think that actually is the most comprehensive approach to being able to review workplace safety management systems, looking at not only the risk profile, but looking at actions that, or the outputs in terms of actions that are capable of creating systemic change, and having the evidence base behind that to actually support why they are needed to create systemic change.
Yeah, thanks. And of course, Comcare's also got an audit tool, and there are various tools out there, so it's well worth jumping onto one of those and looking at the elements and the criteria that are part of that. There's some really good questions and things to consider. Do you have these things in place? So we do have some questions around. You mentioned the changes around COVID, because we have had some questions around hybrid workplaces. They've got staff that are working 2-3 days from the office or home, and working through that balance of work and home, and that's kind of now evolving and changing. Organisations are trying to put in maybe guide rails or something in there. So I might kind of throw off a little bit this, because obviously as head of the School of Psychology and Counselling, you're exposed to some maybe research or some insights that might be coming around hybrid work, or is this something that research is emerging into? Or
yeah, and I think hybrid work has been the research. There has been research on it prior to COVID, without a doubt, and showing the flexibility provides a better work-home life balance, without a doubt. I think in terms of the risk profile, I think, and this is talking from my own understanding rather than from the literature itself, the risk profile being incredibly important to be able to look at any of those like ergonomic issues potentially. I mentioned the vehicle. If people are taking telephone calls within their vehicle, that's another a potential risk, I suppose. So again, it's been able to map what those risk factors are, and I mean that it's a good question in terms of, it makes me think whether that hybrid work arrangement, if there's unique risks that we need to be considering within the home environment included within this our classification scheme. And I'd have to think about that. I think it's more of a contextual thing, but there could be unique risk factors that associated with homework, although it just could come under the banner of just remote work being that psychosocial hazard too. So something to think about for me.
Yeah. I can only imagine this will be a hotbed of research over the next little while, because there's so much diversity of people's appreciation and response towards it, from young workers to, workers who've been in their career for a long time, from those introverts to extroverts to, where your living arrangements are, etc. Yeah, I'm sure it will be a fascinating
I think so. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's definitely got its advantages. I'm an advocate for this, the hybrid work practice. I see it improves productivity. I think when you've got, when you're talking about the element of trust within organisations as well, I can see that there are problems with hybrid work arrangements, but I think in terms of balancing work and home life, life has just become incredibly much more complex, even post-COVID. So I think the workplace needs to respond effectively to that. So hybrid work arrangements, in my view, if the risk is controlled, it's going to improve productivity and efficiency.
Yeah, it's there's almost a reconception of the contract of what is work and what is home life.
Yes,
now, isn't there?
Absolutely. Yeah, we just have to get the balance right,
Yes.
and not allow work to creep into personal life, which is always the challenge.
Yeah. So it was the stat that was reported just a week or two ago that 35% of workers said, if they were forced just back into the office, they'd leave their employer.
Yes.
Right? interesting. There is a strong expectation that that's part of the norm for men.
I completely agree with that. Yep.
While talking about kind of new and future work, obviously the gig economy and contractualisation of work has been something that's been rising. Been one of those mega trends that CSIRO reported on in the previous mega trends report. Is there a risk, there's questions around, is there a risk that work health safety management systems can become disconnected from the people that are actually doing the work versus, people who are part of the organisation?
It's a really good question, and I have a PhD student at Monash University that is looking exactly that issue, looking at the gig economy and the associated risk profile and controls. It's an unknown space at the moment. It's remote work, so it's contextual in some aspects. However, the working arrangements are quite different. I think one of the examples being that we don't, in some of these arrangements, you don't have that supervisor in place to be able to monitor health, safety, well-being. So again, in my research, I've found that line management to be incredibly important, being able to create that culture where safety is valued and prioritised. So where are those values being embedded to ensure that there are safe working practices? And does that reside with the platform providers? Does it reside with regulators? And if that's the case, how are they going to make that connection to make the messages of safety meaningful for the gig economy workers? So I think there is a bit of a degree of separation, I suppose, in gig economy workers, and we need to sort of better understand what the degree of the risk is at this stage. So a lot of work research is being done in this area at the moment. I don't think we have the answers, I have to say, at this point in time.
Yeah, and an interesting sort of connecting question is from Jason, who's said, what experience have you had of addressing job insecurity as a risk factor in safety systems? Because I'm pretty sure that would make a significant difference to reporting.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. And coming from a self-funded centre at Monash University, it does into a more secure environment in terms of job security at QUT. It has made me reflect on that a fair bit lately, actually. And there was an article that was released, that was published about a year ago now, looking at the relationship between neuroticism and job insecurity. Very interesting. It was published in the Journal of Applied Psychology. The first author, I cannot remember, but Mark Griffin is one of the authors on a leading safety expert in Australia. And I thought that's really interesting. And I have to say that I did not forward that article to my colleagues at Monash University. So I thought, I don't want to put the thought into their head that job insecurity is going to lead to neuroticism. But it is something that I think that we need to carefully consider and recognise what the risks are associated with job insecurity.
Yeah. So another interesting topic of conversation was with question that came in around with workplaces becoming more virtual and automated. Do you see kind of anticipate mental health and work intersecting more in the future?
Yes, I think that, well, as we've all learned, I think that there is these elements of health and well-being deteriorating, working primarily from like a remote location. We see that within transportation workers too, particularly long-haul drivers, that isolation is one of the risk factors for adverse health outcomes. So it's something that I think we're not really quite sure about in terms of how it's affecting those that are not working in a transportation industry, for example. But it does make us, I think it makes me reflect in terms of what isolation, the impact of isolation. I think it comes down to, from a risk management perspective, identifying that remote work is a risk factor, to ensure that there are appropriate risk mitigation controls in place, such as regular check-ins with supervisors, being able to monitor and identify risks associated with mental health and well-being.
Yeah, thanks. an interesting question that came in was related to one of the previous ones where they said winning around worker support and how to avoid that perception that work health safety management systems is just a box ticking exercise.
Mm.
We're just doing it to meet the regulators, requirements.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it comes down to that fundamental concept of safety culture, and again, that being a really strong contributor to workplace health and safety. And if there isn't this perception that workplace safety is valued and prioritised, it is going to have an impact in terms of the culture. So unless that, coming back to that first question, workplace culture is that, how incredibly important that is, I completely agree. It is incredibly important, not in isolation to risk management framework within an organisation, but incredibly important in being able to ensure that there is a more holistic approach to safety.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it?
Mm.
Making sure that it's connected, and maybe that also relates back into the connecting with your workers and including them as part of the development of the system, as well as management and leadership to make sure that they're ready, willing and able to sell the system and walk it, rather than it's done by the safety guys off to the side and then somehow they've got to sell it.
Absolutely. It really is. I think workplace safety is about relationship development. It's really that consultation being key to understanding what the key risks are in the organisation and to ensure that any risk controls that are being put in place are feasible and practical for implementation. All of that comes down to adequate consultation and meaningful consultation.
Yeah, great. So we're getting pretty close to the end. We've got maybe time for one more question, which might be sort of focused on the future side of things. Not long ago, CSIRO put out their megatrends report, their latest version of it. Had things like adapting to climate change, kind of the escalating health imperatives, increasing digitisation, in autonomous stuff, which we've sort of talked a little bit about, expectations of workers, which I thought was interesting because it's that expectation of workers being included as part of decisions that are being made. Sort of that also includes customers and citizens, and environmental issues. And I'm wondering, feel free to pick one of those if there's something you want to kind of lay in that future sort of space of the big trends.
Yeah, well, I think just reiterating, I suppose, that the automation issue, and I think it's incredibly easy for organisations to pick up some sort of technology and consider that to be the silver bullet approach to improving safety. I think it's a very dangerous road to go on without integrating that technology within workplace practices. There's no way to have those meaningful consultation, develop those high quality relationships that are capable of creating a safe working environment, safety culture in particular. So unless that technology and the data that comes from that technology can be integrated within safety management practices, I think that it will be problematic in the future. I think I don't believe that the worker will become obsolete in the introduction of different technologies, particularly talking about the transportation industry. I think that there is going to be all those occasions where the worker, the individual will need to take control, particularly when technology fails, for example. So what are the expectations of the individual? And if safety isn't at the forefront of their thinking because it is assumed that technology is going to save them, that's really challenging when you're talking about potential situations of takeover. So I think that thinking that workers, drivers will become obsolete and technology will save safety, I don't think is going to be the future at all.
Okay, so it might be a while yet before we meet in the metaverse to talk safety.
Yes.
But maybe one day the metaverse will be immersive enough, just as long as the satellites don't go down, we'll be okay. Thank you so much, Sharon. So yeah, I want to we're basically out of time. We're wrapping up now. So I want to take a moment to thank you for sharing your insights and being part of such a rich conversation on so many kind of important and interesting topics that are relevant to our work health safety. And of course, thank the audience for you being part of the conversation. So thanks for joining us and have a great day. Stay safe.
Thank you.